The world from the 49th floor of the Aurelia restaurant was not a world of people, but of lights. From this vantage point, nestled in the heart of the city's financial district, the metropolis below transformed into a silent, glittering circuit board, a map of power and influence laid bare for the titans who dined here. The air itself was different, filtered and scented with the subtle aroma of old money, truffles, and an unassailable sense of self-importance. The soundscape was a carefully curated symphony of hushed, consequential conversations, the gentle clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine porcelain, and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of a city that never slept, but which could not dare to disturb the slumber of its masters. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings like frozen constellations, casting a cold, brilliant light on the faces of men and women who moved markets and toppled governments between their appetizer and their main course. It was a golden sanctuary, a gilded cage for the powerful, where the price of a single bottle of wine could sustain a family for a year, and the only thing more expensive than the food was the illusion of untouchability. In this universe of calculated extravagance, Elena Vance was a ghost. She moved through the spaces between the tables with a practiced, silent efficiency, her movements economical and precise. Her uniform, a simple but elegant black dress, was a cloak of invisibility, rendering her nothing more than a functional extension of the restaurant's impeccable service. To the patrons, she was a pair of hands that refilled a water glass, a quiet voice that announced the evening's specials, a shadow that cleared away the remnants of a feast. But beneath this veneer of professional subservience, a storm raged. Her mind, a brilliant and intricate machine, was a repository of knowledge so far removed from this world that its very existence here was a paradox. She was a top-tier legal scholar, masquerading as a waitress, her once promising future in urban planning and contract law reduced to calculating tips and memorizing the vintage of a Bordeaux. Every smile she offered was a carefully constructed mask, hiding the deep, aching grief and the cold, simmering fury that had become the twin engines of her existence. The fury was for her father. The clink of a champagne flute, a sound of celebration here, would transport her back to the deafening silence of a hospital room. She could still smell the dusty, comforting scent of old paper and binding glue that had permeated his small, historic bookstore, a community landmark for over 50 years. Then came the other smell, the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic that followed the stroke. That stroke had not been a random act of biology. It was the final, devastating consequence of a war waged with legal documents and predatory clauses. She remembered the eviction notices from Thorn Global Properties, arriving like clockwork, each one a paper-thin blade, twisting in her father's gut. She remembered his pride slowly eroding, replaced by a constant gnawing anxiety that stole his sleep and hollowed out his eyes. He had been a man of words, a man who believed in the power of stories, and he was ultimately destroyed by the fine print, his life's work dismantled by a soulless corporation that saw his bookstore not as a cultural treasure, but as a stubborn decimal point on a balance sheet. Her grief was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her life, but her secret was a fire she tended to in the lonely hours of the night. After her shifts, when the exhaustion was a physical weight on her shoulders, she would not sleep. Instead, her small apartment, a world away from the opulence of Aurelia, became a war room. Piles of books on municipal zoning codes, historical preservation laws, and corporate real estate contracts covered every surface. She had dropped out of law school to care for her father, but she had never stopped studying. Her photographic memory, once a tool for academic excellence, was now being honed into a weapon. She had dissected every loophole, every clause, every precedent that Thorn Global Properties had used to decimate her neighborhood. She understood the intricate architecture of the laws they had weaponized better than their own high-priced lawyers. Her mind was an arsenal of facts, figures, and legal arguments, all of it waiting, dormant for a target. She carried this encyclopedic knowledge within her, a secret power hidden behind the placid expression of a woman asking if you would prefer still or sparkling water. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below and be sure to subscribe to join our community. You're about to witness an incredible story of resilience, and we want you to be a part of it. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do it so you're always here for stories like this. The atmosphere in Aurelia, already rarefied, shifted when Marcus Thorne arrived. It was not a grand entrance, but the effect was immediate and profound, like a predator entering a watering hole, causing all the other animals to freeze. The ambient murmur of conversation dipped in volume. Waitress seemed to stand a little straighter. He was a man who didn't need to announce his power. It radiated from him in waves of cold, effortless arrogance. He moved through the restaurant not as a guest but as a conqueror, inspecting his territory, his eyes sweeping over the room with a dismissive gaze that catalogued everything and valued nothing. He was flanked by two younger associates who orbited him like nervous moons, their expressions a mixture of fear and sycophantic admiration. He waved away the maître d' with a flick of his wrist, his Patek Philippe watch catching the light, and pointed to the best table in the house, the one with the panoramic corner view, as if it were his birthright. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low baritone that sliced through the hushed tones of the restaurant, accustomed to being the only one that mattered. The incident began with a sound that did not belong in this carefully controlled environment, the soft scuffle of a shoe, a faint, startled gasp, and the quiet, heavy thud of a body hitting the plush carpet. An elderly woman, dressed in a simple but elegant tweed suit, had stumbled and fallen near the center of the dining room. For a moment, there was a collective pause, a brief flicker of shared humanity. But it was quickly extinguished. Annoyed glances were cast. A few patrons sighed with theatrical impatience, as if the woman's misfortune were a personal inconvenience. From his throne-like table, Marcus Thorne let out a harsh, barking laugh that drew all eyes to him. He leaned toward his associates, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate cruelty. He made a joke about some people not belonging in such a refined place, a cruel jab at her age and perceived frailty. His words were a clear signal to everyone else. This woman was not one of them. She was an obstacle, an unsightly disruption to their evening of elite indulgence. While the other staff members hesitated, caught between protocol and basic human decency, Elena moved. A voice in her head, the voice of the restaurant manager, screamed at her to not make a scene, to let security handle it, to remain invisible. But another voice, the voice of her father, the one that taught her that a person's worth was measured by how they treated those who could do nothing for them, was louder. She ignored the stares and the whispers, her training as a waitress momentarily forgotten, replaced by a simple, profound instinct to help. She knelt beside the fallen woman, her own body shielding her from the curious and contemptuous gazes of the other diners. She spoke in a low, calming voice, asking if she was hurt, her hands gentle as she helped the woman gather her composure and her belongings. It was a small, quiet act of kindness, a single, clear note of compassion, in a symphony of cold indifference, and in this place, it was an act of rebellion. After ensuring the elderly woman was comfortably seated and had a glass of water, Elena turned to resume her duties, but Marcus Thorne was not finished. He saw her simple act of kindness not as a virtue, but as an opportunity for a demonstration. He beckoned her to his table with an imperious snap of his fingers, a gesture one might use for a dog. He wanted to use her as a prop for his business discussion. He began to pontificate loudly about a new development project he was planning, a massive high-rise that would tear through another historic neighborhood. He unrolled a small blueprint on the table and, with a smirk, mockingly referenced an obscure zoning ordinance, something he called Code 17B, Section 4, as a trivial piece of red tape his lawyers would easily bypass. He looked directly at Elena as he said it, a sneer playing on his lips, assuming the ignorant waitress wouldn't understand a single word. In that moment, as his condescending gaze fell upon her, The image of her father's weary face flashed in her mind. The insult was no longer general, it was personal. The storm inside her, so long contained, finally found its focus. The ghost of Aurelia was about to speak. The world inside Aurelia held its breath. For a single, stretched-out second, the universe seemed to pivot on the quiet, steady cadence of Elena's voice. The air, once filled with the self-important hum of business and pleasure, was now a vacuum, and her words were the only thing that existed within it. Marcus Thorne's face, a moment ago a mask of sneering condescension, had frozen. The smirk was still there, a fossilized remnant of his arrogance, but his eyes, those cold, calculating orbs, were now wide with a confusion so profound it bordered on disbelief. He was a man who had built an empire on the bedrock of predictability, on knowing every angle, on ensuring that every person in his orbit behaved exactly as their station dictated. A waitress was meant to be furniture that could speak, a functional object, not a sentient being with a mind capable of challenging his. The sheer impossibility of the moment was what struck him first, a glitch in the matrix of his perfectly ordered world. Elena felt the shift not as a victory but as the drawing of a deep, cleansing breath after years of holding it in. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs with a frantic, terrified rhythm, suddenly found a new tempo. It was slow, powerful, and steady, each beat a confirmation of her own existence, her own worth. The heat of humiliation that had flooded her cheeks was replaced by a cool, clarifying calm. She stood straighter, her posture subtly altering from one of professional deference to one of quiet authority. She was no longer Elena Vance, the waitress. In that instant, she became the sum of every book she had read, every late night spent poring over legal texts while her father slept fitfully in the next room, every ounce of pain and fury she had meticulously channeled into knowledge. She met Thorne's gaze without flinching, her own eyes clear and direct, and in their depths he could no longer see a servant, he saw an equal. "You are mistaken about Code 17B, Section 4, Mr. Thorne." Her voice did not tremble. It was not loud, but it sliced through the hushed ambiance of the restaurant with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was a statement of fact, delivered with an unassailable certainty that left no room for argument. The two associates at Thorne's table, who had been snickering into their napkins moments before, now stared at her, their mouths slightly agape. They looked from her to their boss and back again, their expressions a comical blend of shock and fear, as if a statue had suddenly started reciting Shakespeare. The illusion of the room, the carefully constructed hierarchy that placed them at the top and her at the bottom, had been shattered by a single, perfectly enunciated sentence. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with a swift, brutal elegance that left everyone in its vicinity reeling. She did not wait for his response. To do so would have been to cede the floor back to him, to allow him to regain his footing. Instead, she continued, her tone remaining level and academic, as if she were a professor correcting a particularly slow student. Code 17.B, Section 4, she explained, does not simply pertain to historical facade preservation, as your legal team has likely advised you. It contains a subclause, 4.2a, which was amended in 2008 after the landmark Harrison Trust versus the City of New York case. This subclause explicitly protects the foundational integrity of any adjacent structure designated as a Class II historical landmark which, as you know, includes the entire block your proposed demolition site borders. Her recitation was flawless, the words flowing from her with an ease that spoke of thousands of hours of obsessive study. She wasn't just quoting a rule, she was wielding it, turning the very weapon of fine print that had destroyed her family back on its master. A faint memory surfaced in her mind, unbidden but powerful. It was the scent of old paper and leather from her father's bookstore, the quiet scratch of his pen as he made notes in a margin. He had taught her that knowledge was the only true form of power, the only currency that could not be stolen. He had believed in the sanctity of the law, in the idea that the rules were there to protect the small from the mighty. He had been wrong, of course. The rules were merely tools, and they belonged to whoever knew how to use them best. For years, men like Thorn had used them to dismantle lives. Now, in this temple of their power, she was demonstrating that she had not only learned their language, she had mastered it. This was for her father. This was for every small business owner, every family, every life that had been dismissed as a rounding error on a corporate spreadsheet. The first crack appeared in Thorn's composure. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch uncontrollably. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now slowly suffused with a dark, mottled red, the color of rising fury. He tried to speak, to interrupt her, to dismiss her with a wave of his hand, but the words wouldn't come. He was a man accustomed to controlling every conversation, but he had no vocabulary for this. How could he argue with a waitress who was quoting municipal code back at him with more accuracy than his own multi-million-dollar legal department? His entire foundation was built on the assumption of his own intellectual superiority, and she was systematically dismantling it, brick by brick, in front of his subordinates. The humiliation was a physical thing, a tightening in his chest, a bitter metallic taste in his mouth. Elena pressed her advantage, her voice never rising, her calm a stark contrast to his barely contained rage. Furthermore, she continued, the precedent set by the 2011 appellate court ruling in Ginsburg v. Sterling Development is directly applicable here. It established that any new construction that alters the subterranean water table in a way that could compromise the pilings of a pre-war designated structure is subject to a mandatory 5-year environmental impact review, not the 6-month review your team has filed for. Her memory was a fortress, each case, each date, each legal citation, a perfectly placed stone in its walls. She saw the blueprints in her mind, the zoning maps, the legal brief she had studied until the words were burned onto the back of her eyelids. She was not just speaking. She was building a case, right here, between the breadbasket and the wine glasses. Finally, there is the matter of the covenant attached to the original deed of the old Merchants Bank building, which I assume your acquisition team conveniently overlooked. It's a public record, filed in 1922. It grants an air rights easement to the adjacent community garden, a protected public space. Your current architectural plans, which include a cantilevered 13th floor, are in direct violation of that century-old covenant. Building your tower as planned is not just difficult, Mr. Thorne. It is flagrantly, unequivocally illegal on at least 3 distinct and indefensible counts. She finished. The final word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The silence that followed was no longer just a pause in conversation. It was a verdict. She had not raised her voice. She had not insulted him. She had not used a single word that was not a matter of public record. She had simply used the truth, and in this room built on illusions, the truth was a devastating weapon. The spell was broken. Thorne's rage, which had been simmering beneath the surface, finally erupted. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the polished floor. The sound was a desecration in the sacred quiet of the restaurant. "Fire this insolent brat!" he bellowed, his voice a raw, ugly thing, stripped of all its cultivated polish. He pointed a trembling finger at Elena, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "Do you know who I am? I will own this restaurant by morning, just to have the pleasure of firing you myself." His associates shrank back in their seats, terrified of the volcanic eruption. The restaurant manager, a perpetually nervous man named Julian, came scurrying over, his face ashen, his hands fluttering uselessly at his sides. He saw not a waitress and a customer, but a multi-million-dollar account and an existential threat to his career. Just as Julian opened his mouth to stammer out an apology and do Thorne's bidding, the grand double doors at the entrance of Aurelia swung open with a silent, deliberate force. The atmosphere in the room, already tense, underwent another seismic shift. The fear that had been localized around Thorne's table now spread through the entire restaurant like a contagion. A man strode in, flanked by two others who moved with the quiet, predatory grace of panthers. He was not large, but he possessed a density of presence that seemed to warp the space around him. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair impeccably styled, he moved with an unhurried confidence that spoke of absolute, unquestioned power. Every eye in the room was drawn to him. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks were frozen halfway to mouths. This was Leo, the gentleman Moretti, the head of the city's oldest and most feared crime family, a man whose name was only ever spoken in whispers. The room held a collective, terrified breath. Leo Moretti was a ghost from a different era, a figure who was not supposed to exist in these modern, sanitized halls of corporate power. His presence here was a collision of worlds, the brutal, old world order of the street confronting the sterile, new world order of the boardroom. He ignored the maitre d', who approached him with a terrified expression. He ignored the stares of the captains of industry and finance who filled the room. His gaze swept across the scene, taking in the tableau of the furious billionaire, the terrified manager, and the preternaturally calm waitress. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, seemed to miss nothing. They were the eyes of a man who understood the intricate and often invisible machinery of the city, the hidden levers of power that truly made things work. His gaze finally settled on the elderly woman whom Elena had helped, who was now sitting quietly at a small table near the wall, watching the drama unfold with a serene, almost detached expression. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Moretti's eyes. Without a word to anyone else, he began to walk, his path a straight, unwavering line directly toward her. The other patrons, men and women of immense wealth and influence, instinctively leaned away as he passed, as if his very proximity might be dangerous. He moved through the room not like a guest, but like a king moving through his court. His authority absolute and innate. He was the real power in the city, and everyone in this room, for all their billions, knew it on a primal, cellular level. When he reached the old woman's table, the impossible happened. Leo the gentleman Moretti, a man before whom judges and politicians trembled, slowly and gracefully knelt down on one knee. The gesture was so shocking, so utterly out of character with his fearsome reputation, that a collective gasp went through the room. He took the old woman's hand in his touch gentle and reverent. He bowed his head slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was not the cold, menacing tone of a crime boss, but was filled with a genuine, profound warmth and concern. "Nana," he said, the word echoing in the stunned silence. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you all right?" The old woman smiled, a small, fond smile, and patted his hand. "I am fine, Leonardo. A little stumble, that is all. This very kind young lady helped me." Leo Moretti slowly rose to his feet. He turned his head and his pale blue eyes met Elena's. He did not smile, but he gave her a single, slow nod. It was a gesture that carried an immense weight, a silent acknowledgement of a debt incurred, a sign of respect from a man who offered it to almost no one. It was a look that said, "I see you. I understand what you did." In that single, silent exchange, a connection was forged, an alliance unknowingly formed. Then, his gaze shifted to Marcus Thorne. The warmth was gone, replaced by an arctic coldness that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by several degrees. Thorne, who had been frozen mid-rant, felt that gaze land on him like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of pale. He recognized Leo Moretti, as everyone did, and he understood in that instant that he had made a catastrophic, universe-altering mistake. The manager, Julian, was trapped. He was caught between the incandescent rage of a billionaire patron and the silent, terrifying judgment of the city's most powerful mob boss. He was a man drowning in a situation far beyond his capacity to handle. In a fatal miscalculation driven by the ingrained habit of appeasing corporate wealth, he chose the devil he knew. He turned to Elena, his voice a pathetic, trembling squeak. "You're fired," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "Please, collect your things and leave immediately." The words, meant to placate Thorne, were a death sentence in the new reality of the room. A flicker of disappointment, cold and sharp, crossed Leo Moretti's face. The manager saw it and realized, with a dawning, sickening horror, that in trying to solve his problem, he had just signed away his future. Elena felt the words wash over her, but they had lost their sting. A few minutes ago, being fired would have been a catastrophe, a terrifying plunge into uncertainty that threatened her ability to care for her father. But now it felt strangely insignificant. She had spoken her truth. She had defended her father's memory. She had faced down the monster who had ruined their lives and had not blinked. She looked at the terrified face of her manager, the apoplectic rage of Marcus Thorne, and the cold, appraising stare of Leo Moretti, and she felt a sense of calm descend upon her. She had lost a job, but she had regained something far more valuable: her own voice. She simply nodded, a small, dignified gesture of acceptance, and turned to walk away, leaving the wreckage of 3 powerful men's composure in her wake. Her walk out of the restaurant was not the shuffling retreat of a disgraced employee. She moved with a newfound purpose, her back straight, her head held high. The other diners watched her go, their expressions a mixture of awe, pity, and fear. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had publicly humiliated Marcus Thorne and earned a nod of respect from Leo Moretti. She had become a legend in the span of 5 minutes. As she passed the bar, she could feel the weight of their stares, could hear the frantic whispers breaking out behind her. But none of it mattered. Her mind was already moving forward, calculating, planning. The confrontation had not been an end. She now realized it was a beginning. It was a declaration of war. She pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out from the climate-controlled perfection of Aurelia into the raw, chaotic reality of the New York City night. The air was cold and sharp against her skin, carrying the smells of street food and exhaust fumes. The distant wail of a siren cut through the night, a sound that was a normal part of the city's symphony but now felt like a premonition. The glittering, godlike view from the 49th floor was gone, replaced by the gritty, street-level perspective of ordinary life. For a moment, the full weight of her situation threatened to crush her. She was unemployed. Her father's medical bills were a relentless, towering mountain of debt. She had just made an enemy of one of the most ruthless billionaires in the city. A wave of dizziness and fear washed over her, and she had to lean against the cold stone of the building to steady herself. She closed her eyes, and the image of her father's face appeared in her mind. Not the tired, vacant face from the hospital bed, but the face from before, from the bookstore. The face of a man animated by stories, his eyes twinkling as he recommended a book to a child. The memory of his strength, his quiet integrity, flowed into her, pushing back the tide of despair. She had not started this fight, but she would be the one to finish it. The anger that had been a simmering coal deep inside her for years now roared into a controlled, focused flame. Thorne had not just insulted a waitress, he had desecrated the memory of a good man, and for that there had to be a reckoning. Her fear did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, unshakable resolve. She would not be a victim anymore. The journey home on the subway was a blur. The press of bodies, the screech of the train's wheels, the flickering fluorescent lights, it all seemed to belong to a different world, a different life. Her apartment, when she finally reached it, felt smaller than ever, the stacks of legal books and zoning maps seeming to close in on her. For a moment, she saw them not as an arsenal, but as a monument to her own powerlessness, a collection of theories that had done nothing to save her father. The despair she had fought off outside the restaurant returned, cold and insidious, whispering in her ear that she was a fool, that she had thrown away her only means of survival for a single, fleeting moment of defiance. She sank onto her small sofa, the exhaustion of the night, of the past few years, finally catching up to her. She must have drifted off because she was startled awake by a soft, insistent tapping on her apartment door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was of Thorn. Had he sent someone? Was this the beginning of his retaliation? She crept to the door, her breath held tight in her chest, and peered through the peephole. A man stood in the dimly lit hallway, dressed in a simple, dark suit. He was unremarkable, his face impassive, but he carried himself with an air of quiet professionalism that was somehow more unnerving than overt menace. She did not recognize him. She remained silent, hoping he would go away. He did not. He simply waited, patient and still. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low, respectful murmur that carried easily through the thin wood of the door. "Miss Vance, my name is not important. I have a message for you from Mr. Moretti. He said to tell you that he and his grandmother admire your courage. He believes you, and he may have a shared interest in the business practices of Thorn Global Properties." The words hung in the air, a shocking, unbelievable offer. It was a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a raging sea. Her mind raced, weighing the implications. To align herself with a man like Leo Moretti was to step into a world of shadows and violence, a world from which there was no easy return. But it was also a world of immense resources, of access to information that she could never hope to obtain on her own. She slowly unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door a few inches, the security chains still in place. The man in the hallway did not try to look inside. He simply held out a plain manila envelope. "Mr. Moretti invites you to a meeting tomorrow, at your convenience." This envelope contains some preliminary information he thought you might find illuminating. He hopes it will demonstrate the potential of a partnership. He placed the envelope on the floor, then gave a slight formal bow of his head and turned, walking silently down the hallway and disappearing down the stairs. Elena waited until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded before she closed and locked her door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. With trembling hands, she picked up the envelope. It was thick and heavy. She sat down at her small kitchen table, the one surface not completely covered in books, and tore it open. Inside were not threats or money, but documents, financial statements, offshore account numbers, redacted sworn affidavits from former Thorn Global employees. It was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, a roadmap to the dark, corrupt heart of Marcus Thorn's empire. As she spread the papers out under the dim light of her kitchen, she saw names and dates that corresponded with the destruction of her own neighborhood. Here was the proof of the bribery, the intimidation, the illegal shell corporations. It was everything she had suspected but had never been able to prove. A cold, hard clarity settled over her. The choice was no longer a choice. To refuse this offer would be to let Thorn win, to let her father's suffering be for nothing. To accept it was to walk a dangerous path, but it was the only path that led to justice. She looked from the Moretti files to her own stacks of legal books. One represented the brutal hidden power of the underworld, the other, the complex, public power of the law. Separately, they were potent. Together, she realized, they would be unstoppable. For the first time in years, a genuine, unforced smile touched her lips. It was a grim, determined smile. Marcus Thorn had laughed at a waitress. He had no idea he had just created the architect of his own destruction. Her small apartment was no longer a refuge of grief. It transformed back into a war room. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and purpose. She began to work, her brilliant mind firing on all cylinders. She cross-referenced the names in the Moretti files with property deeds she had already researched. She connected the offshore account transfers to the timelines of hostile takeovers. Patterns began to emerge, a vast and intricate web of corruption that was even more audacious than she had imagined. She saw how Thorn had used legal loopholes to mask criminal activity, how he had weaponized the law to protect himself while he broke it with impunity. Her expertise was the key, the decoder ring that could translate these raw financial data points into a coherent, damning legal narrative. She worked through the night, the city outside growing quiet and then slowly waking again. The first pale light of dawn crept through her window, finding her not asleep, but bent over her table, a pen in her hand, her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop screen. She was no longer just a scholar or a victim. She was a strategist, a general mapping out a campaign. The initial shock of the previous night had been forged into a weapon. Her grief was her armor. Her knowledge was her sword. The files from Leo Moretti were her cavalry. The battle had been a long time coming, but now, finally, she was ready. She knew her first move. She knew who she needed to find. Her plan was beginning to take shape, a meticulous, multi-layered strategy designed not just to expose Marcus Thorne, but to dismantle his entire empire, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the rubble of his own arrogance. The first step was not to leak the information. That would be too simple, too easy for Thorne to dismiss as a smear campaign. No, her attack had to be surgical, and it had to be public. It needed a platform, a voice of unimpeachable credibility. She thought of a name, a man she had admired during her time at the university, David Chen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist known for his relentless and fearless takedowns of corporate criminals. He had gone quiet in recent years, pushed out of the mainstream media for being too aggressive, too unwilling to compromise. He was now running a small, independent online publication, but his reputation for integrity was spotless. He would be the perfect ally, the catalyst she needed to turn her evidence into a public spectacle. Her mind was a whirlwind of activity, connecting dots, formulating strategies, and anticipating Thorne's every possible countermove. She knew he would come after her. He would use his immense resources to dig into her past, to discredit her, to paint her as a disgruntled, unstable former employee. She had to be prepared for that. She had to build an airtight case, one that rested not on her testimony, but on a foundation of irrefutable, independently verifiable evidence. The Moretti files were the start, but she needed more. She needed to connect Thorne's broad pattern of racketeering directly to the specific destruction of her father's neighborhood, to make the crime personal and undeniable. She thought about the other shop owners, the other families who had been forced out. Many had signed non-disclosure agreements, silenced by Thorne's lawyers. But some had not. Some had just faded away, broken and defeated. If she could find them, if she could convince them to speak, their stories would provide the human, emotional core to her legal and financial evidence. They would be the faces of Thorne's victims, a chorus of voices rising up to condemn him. It would be difficult. They would be scared. But she remembered the look in her father's eyes, the quiet despair of a man watching his life's work turn to dust, and she knew she had to try. She would not let their stories be forgotten. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across her floor. She looked at the city awakening outside her window. It no longer looked like an intimidating, unconquerable fortress of power. It looked like a puzzle, a system of interlocking pieces that she was beginning to understand. For the first time, she felt not like a victim of the city, but like a part of it, a force that could shape its future. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady, and found the contact information for David Chen's publication. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now a fuel, not a brake. She was about to step out of the shadows and declare war on one of the most powerful men in the world. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was going to win. The night at Aurelia had changed everything. It had stripped away her invisibility, her protective camouflage, and had thrust her into the center of a dangerous game. But it had also given her a clarity she had not possessed before. She was no longer just surviving, no longer just enduring. She was fighting back. The memory of Marcus Thorne's sneering face, the sound of his cruel laughter, was a constant reminder of what was at stake. This was not about revenge, she told herself. It was about justice. It was about restoring the balance, about proving that the law could be a shield for the powerless, not just a club for the powerful. It was about honoring her father in the only way she had left, by using the knowledge he had so cherished to right the wrongs that had broken him. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a sense of renewed purpose. The path ahead was fraught with danger, and the outcome was far from certain. But as she looked at the evidence spread before her, a meticulously documented history of one man's greed and another's suffering, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her purpose in the wreckage of her life. The ghost of Aurelia was gone, and in her place stood a woman ready to burn an empire to the ground. The first phone call was about to be made, the first domino about to be pushed. The quiet waitress was about to become the storm that Marcus Thorne never saw coming. Her finger hovered over the call button. This was the point of no return. Once she contacted, her finger hovered over the call button, a small circle of light that represented the threshold between her old life and the new one she was about to forge in fire. This was the point of no return. Once she contacted David Chen, the world-renowned investigative journalist, she would be stepping onto a stage from which there was no quiet exit. The name had come to her in the pre-dawn hours, a beacon of integrity in the murky world she was about to navigate. Chen was a legend, a man who had toppled corrupt senators and exposed corporate malfeasance with nothing but his relentless pursuit of the truth and his unshakable belief in the power of a well-told story. He had been pushed to the fringes by the very media conglomerates that once celebrated him, now running a small, fiercely independent online publication from a dusty office downtown. He was perfect, he was hungry, he was principled, and most importantly, he had a deep and abiding hatred for bullies like Marcus Thorne. Taking a final, steadying breath, a breath that felt like it was drawing in all the courage she had left in the world, she pressed the icon. The phone began to ring, each tone an echo of a hammer striking an anvil, forging her future. The office of the Sentinel, David Chen's publication, was the complete antithesis of Aurelia. It was on the third floor of a pre-war building with a temperamental elevator, tucked away on a side street that smelled perpetually of roasted nuts and damp pavement. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper, brewing coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of aging computer hardware. There were no crystal chandeliers here, only fluorescent tube lights that hummed a weary, monotonous tune. Instead of plush carpets, the floor was covered in scuffed linoleum, and the walls were obscured by towering, precarious stacks of newspapers, legal binders, and books that threatened to collapse at any moment. At the center of this organized chaos sat David Chen himself. He looked older than his photographs, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and hard-fought battles. His eyes, when he looked up at Elena, were tired and deeply skeptical, the eyes of a man who had heard 1,000 stories of injustice and knew that most of them ended in heartbreak and compromise. He gestured to a rickety wooden chair, his expression making it clear that he had 5 minutes for her, and not a second more. Elena did not begin with the story of her father. She knew that an appeal to emotion would be met with professional cynicism. Men like Chen were hardened against sob stories. They dealt in facts, in evidence, in the cold, hard currency of proof. So she began with the law. She laid out her analysis of Thorne's new project, the same one she had delivered at the restaurant, but this time she went deeper, citing obscure land use precedents from the 1930s and recent appellate court rulings on environmental impact assessments. She spoke quietly, her voice even and precise, her argument structured with the clean, irrefutable logic of a legal brief. She watched as a flicker of interest ignited in Chen's tired eyes. The skepticism didn't vanish, but it was joined by a grudging respect. He had seen countless whistleblowers and victims, but he had never seen one come to him with a fully formed, flawlessly researched legal case. He leaned forward slightly, the first sign that she had broken through his wall of professional detachment. Then she played her ace. She slid the manila envelope, the one given to her by Leo Moretti's emissary, across the cluttered surface of his desk. She didn't tell him where it came from. She simply said that a source with a shared interest in Thorne's activities had provided it. Chen opened the clasp and began to leaf through the documents. His practiced, cynical demeanor began to crumble, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator catching a scent. He saw the offshore account numbers, the redacted names of shell corporations, the internal memos hinting at bribery and coercion. His breath caught audibly when he saw a document detailing a series of payments to a holding company linked to a notoriously corrupt city planning commissioner. He looked up from the papers, and for the first time, he truly saw Elena. The tired skepticism in his eyes was gone, replaced by a brilliant, dangerous glint. This wasn't just another story of corporate greed. This was a career-defining exposé. This was the kind of story he had been waiting for, the kind of fight he was born to wage. The meeting with Leo Moretti was a far more delicate and dangerous affair. It took place not in a public restaurant or a sterile office, but in the back room of a small, family-owned bakery in Little Italy, a neighborhood Thorne's development projects were slowly strangling. The air smelled of anise and fresh bread, a comforting domestic scent that was utterly at odds with the man sitting across the small table from her. Leo Moretti was not the brutish caricature of a mob boss she might have imagined. He was impeccably dressed, his movements were economical and precise, and his voice was a low, cultured murmur, but his power was a palpable force in the small room, a silent, heavy pressure that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He acknowledged her courage at the restaurant and expressed his grandmother's gratitude. Then he got to business, his pale blue eyes watching her with an unnerving, analytical calm, assessing her, measuring her resolve. Elena felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach, a primal instinct warning her that she was swimming in waters far deeper and more dangerous than she had ever known. This was not the world of law books and academic debate. This was a world where disputes were not settled in courtrooms, where justice was a concept defined by loyalty and power, not precedent and statute. Yet, as she met Moretti's gaze, she did not allow her fear to show. She thought of her father, of the powerlessness she had felt watching his life crumble. She had learned a hard lesson. The world was not a fair place, and to fight monsters, sometimes you had to be willing to walk through the shadows. She explained her plan, her need for more than just financial records. She needed human intelligence, a witness from inside Thorne's organization who could connect the paper trail to the man himself. She needed someone who could testify to the criminal intent behind the legal maneuvers. Moretti listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she had finished, he simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. He seemed to appreciate her directness, her refusal to be intimidated. He told her that Thorne's aggressive expansion had not only destroyed small businesses, but had also disrupted certain, shall we say, long-standing business arrangements that his family oversaw. Their interests, he explained, were aligned. He made a quiet phone call, speaking in rapid, hushed Italian. Less than 20 minutes later, a man was ushered into the back room. He was a nervous, bird-like man in his late 50s, his face etched with worry. Moretti introduced him as Arthur Pembroke, a former senior accountant for Thorne Global Properties. Pembroke, Moretti explained, had been forced into early retirement after he began asking too many questions about certain irregularities in the company's books. His retirement had been made more comfortable and his continued health assured by the Moretti family's patronage. Arthur Pembroke was terrified, but his terror of Leo Moretti was slightly outweighed by his deep-seated hatred for Marcus Thorne. Thorne had not only fired him, but had also systematically destroyed his professional reputation, blacklisting him throughout the industry. With trembling hands, Arthur slid a small, encrypted flash drive across the table to Elena. On it, he whispered, was a copy of Thorne's real ledgers, the shadow books that documented every bribe, every kickback, every illegal transaction, all meticulously recorded and then erased from the official records. It was the Rosetta Stone to Thorne's criminal empire. As Elena's fingers closed around the small, cool piece of plastic, she felt a surge of cold triumph. This was it. This was the weapon that could bring him down. She had the legal framework, she had the financial paper trail, and now, thanks to this terrified man, she had the irrefutable proof of criminal conspiracy. The alliance was sealed, not with a handshake, but with the shared understanding of a common enemy. The weeks that followed were a descent into a relentless, obsessive hunt. Elena's apartment became the official war room, its walls covered in timelines, corporate flowcharts, and photographs of key players. Sleep became a luxury she could not afford, her nights fueled by lukewarm coffee and a burning, unyielding sense of purpose. She and David Chen worked in tandem, a perfectly synchronized team. She was the legal architect, deciphering the complex structures of Thorne's shell corporations and tracing the flow of illicit money through a labyrinth of international banks. Chen was the street-smart investigator, using his decades of experience and his network of contacts to track down the human cost of Thorne's ambition. He found the people whose lives had been shattered, the ghosts of the neighborhood Thorne had erased from the map. Their first major obstacle was fear. They tracked down the former owner of a family-run bakery, a man whose business had been in his family for 3 generations. They found him working as a night janitor in a downtown office building, his pride broken, his eyes haunted. He listened to their story, his hands clenched into tight fists, but in the end, he shook his head. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement, a document Thorne's lawyers had forced on him in exchange for a paltry settlement. He was terrified of the legal and financial ruin Thorne could bring down upon his family if he spoke out. Elena saw in his eyes the same defeated look she had seen in her father's, and it filled her with a fresh wave of cold fury. Thorne had not just taken their businesses, he had taken their voices, silencing them with the very legal system that was supposed to protect them. They faced one dead end after another. A key witness, a former secretary in Thorne's executive suite who had reportedly complained about his practices, had moved to Europe and vanished without a trace. Another potential source, the owner of a small hardware store who had initially tried to organize the neighborhood resistance, had died of a heart attack 6 months after losing his business. His widow was too lost in her grief to speak with them. Each failure was a blow, a chipping away at their morale. There were moments, in the dead of night, when the sheer scale of Thorne's power seemed insurmountable, when Elena felt the crushing weight of her own audacity. In those moments, she would pull out a faded photograph of her father, taken in his bookstore, a wide, genuine smile on his face. She would look at that picture and remember why she was doing this. It was not for her. It was for him, and for all the others whose stories had been buried under the foundations of Thorne's glass towers. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely of places, a single, overlooked filing with the corporate registry of the Cayman Islands. While cross-referencing the data from Arthur Pembroke's flash drive with public records, Elena stumbled upon a discrepancy. It was a tiny error, a piece of digital carelessness in an otherwise flawless criminal enterprise. A document amending the directorship of a shell corporation named Apex Holdings had been filed hastily. In the metadata of the PDF, a junior lawyer had forgotten to scrub the name of the original authoring attorney from Thorne's in-house legal team. It was a digital fingerprint, a direct, traceable link between the anonymous offshore entity and Thorne Global Properties headquarters in New York. It was the thread she needed to unravel the entire tapestry of deceit. This single thread led her deeper into the labyrinth. Following the trail of Apex Holdings, she discovered it was the primary vehicle used to funnel money to another shell company, this one registered in Delaware, called Urban Renewal Consultants. This second company was the one that had made a series of large, undocumented payments to the wife of Bartholomew Reed, the city planning commissioner who had controversially approved the rezoning of her father's neighborhood, overriding the objections of the Historical Preservation Society. The payments had been disguised as consulting fees for interior design services, a laughable cover for a woman with no design experience whatsoever. Elena had found it. The smoking gun. It was a clean, direct line. from Thorne's company to an offshore account to a bribe that had sealed the fate of an entire community. The information was explosive, a meticulously documented chain of corruption that was undeniable. She and Chen worked feverishly to compile the evidence into a single, devastating dossier. They created charts that visualized the flow of money, timelines that aligned the bribes with key political decisions, and legal arguments that were airtight and indefensible. They cross-referenced every transaction with Arthur Pembroke's shadow ledgers, creating a narrative so compelling and so thoroughly sourced that no army of lawyers could discredit it. The sheer weight of the evidence was staggering. It was a monument to Marcus Thorne's greed, built brick by brick with his own crimes. Elena felt a sense of awe as she looked at their work. It was more than just an investigation. It was an indictment. As they prepared to launch their attack, Marcus Thorne began to feel the pressure. He was a predator who could sense a shift in the currents, a change in the wind. Chen had begun publishing a series of carefully worded articles on his website, asking pointed questions about urban development practices and the surprising profitability of certain city officials. The articles never mentioned Thorne by name, but the implications were clear. Anonymous sources from within the city planning department, likely spooked by Chen's inquiries, began to leak information. Thorne, accustomed to operating with complete impunity, suddenly found his name being whispered in connection with an impending scandal. His arrogance, however, did not allow him to see the true nature of the threat. He still saw a disgruntled waitress and a washed-up journalist, not the architects of his doom. His response was predictable and clumsy. He dispatched his lawyers to send cease-and-desist letters to Chen, threatening a billion-dollar defamation lawsuit. The threats were empty, a bully's attempt at intimidation, and Chen, who had faced down far more dangerous opponents, simply laughed and published the letters on his website, where they were met with public ridicule. Thorne then sent private investigators to dig up dirt on Elena, hoping to discredit her. They found nothing but the story of a devoted daughter who had sacrificed her future to care for her ailing father, a narrative that only served to make her more sympathetic. His every move was a misstep, born from his fatal flaw, the inability to see the person he had wronged as anything more than an insignificant insect. He was swatting at wasps, unaware that he was standing on a hornet's nest. The final piece of the plan fell into place when Thorne, in a spectacular display of hubris, announced a major press conference. He would be unveiling his legacy project, a massive, multi-billion-dollar development called the Thorne Elysian, which he was billing as the future of the city. The mayor and other city officials would be in attendance. It would be broadcast on every major news network. It was designed to be his coronation, the moment he cemented his status as a titan of industry and a civic visionary. When Elena saw the announcement, she knew. This was their stage. They would not leak the story to the press and allow Thorne to control the narrative, to dismiss it as fake news. They would confront him in his moment of greatest triumph and turn it into his public execution. The night before the press conference, Elena stood in her apartment, the completed dossier in her hands. It was a thick, heavy document, each page representing a sleepless night, a moment of despair, a flash of insight. It was the story of her father, and of so many others, translated into the cold, hard language of evidence. She felt a profound and solemn calm settle over her. The rage was still there, a pilot light burning steadily within her, but it was no longer a consuming fire. It was a focused, controlled energy. She was no longer a victim seeking revenge. She was an agent of justice, holding the scales in her hands. Tomorrow, in front of the entire world, she would balance them. The stage was set. The trap was laid. All that was left was for the Titan to walk into it. The grand ballroom of the Sheraton Times Square was a monument to self-congratulation. It was a cavernous space bathed in the cold, blue and white glow of the Thorne Global Properties logo, projected onto every available surface. Hundreds of journalists, city officials, and financial analysts were packed into neat rows of chairs, their faces upturned toward the stage where Marcus Thorne stood, bathed in a spotlight that made him look less like a businessman and more like a messiah. He was at the apex of his power, a conquering king addressing his subjects. The air hummed with the electric charge of money and influence, a carefully orchestrated symphony of success. Through this sea of expensive suits and cynical reporters, Elena Vance moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. She wore a simple, dark gray pantsuit, an outfit that was professional, anonymous, and utterly devoid of the ostentation that filled the room. It was a uniform of a different kind, the armor of a woman who had come not to celebrate, but to lay siege. Her press pass, a gift from Leo Moretti's vast network of influence, hung from her neck, a key to the enemy's fortress. Her heart was not calm. It was a war drum, beating a steady, powerful rhythm against her ribs. With every step she took down the plushly carpeted aisle toward the Q&A microphone, she felt the presence of her father walking beside her, his quiet strength a shield around her, his memory a fire in her veins. When the time for questions arrived, Thorne scanned the room with a magnanimous, predatory smile. His eyes, accustomed to seeking out the most important faces from the most prestigious networks, passed over Elena without a flicker of recognition. To him she was just another anonymous face in the crowd, a minor player in his grand drama. He pointed a dismissive finger in her direction, a gesture of bored noblesse oblige. Yes, the young woman in the back. A quick, easy question, he assumed, before he could move on to the real sycophants. Elena stepped up to the microphone, her hand steady as she adjusted it to her height. The warmth of the stage lights felt like a physical touch. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, could hear the low murmur of the crowd, but it all faded into a distant hum. Her world had shrunk to this single, focused point in time. She took a deep, centering breath, and when she spoke, her voice did not betray a single tremor of fear. It was clear, measured, and carried a weight that immediately silenced the room. "My name is Elena Vance," she began, "and I do not have a question. I have a statement regarding the fraudulent predicate upon which this entire project, and indeed the last decade of Thorne Global's acquisitions, has been built." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Thorne's smile froze on his face, a grotesque mask of disbelief. She did not wait for him to recover. She began her assault, not with accusations, but with facts, her photographic memory unleashing a torrent of data with the devastating precision of a Gatling gun. She started with the Cayman Islands, with a shell corporation named Apex Holdings. She detailed its formation on March 12, 2014, the names of its nominee directors, and the metadata signature she had discovered on a carelessly filed amendment, a digital fingerprint that traced its authorship directly back to Thorne's own in-house counsel, a Mr. Gerald Finney. The journalists, who had been lazily taking notes, were now typing with a frantic, furious energy, their faces illuminated by the glow of their laptops. From the corner of her eye, she saw David Chen, standing near the back wall, a grim, triumphant smile on his face. She then detailed the flow of untraceable funds from Apex Holdings to a secondary shell company in Delaware, Urban Renewal Consultants, citing specific wire transfer numbers and dates that corresponded perfectly with the shadow ledgers provided by Arthur Pembroke. Marcus Thorne's face had gone from a healthy tan to a sickly, waxy pale. He was gripping the sides of his lectern, his knuckles white, his mind struggling to comprehend how this was happening, how this nobody could possess such impossible knowledge. Then came the killing blow, the moment she connected the abstract world of offshore finance to the concrete reality of human suffering. "These funds," she announced, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth, were then dispersed as a series of thinly veiled bribes totaling over $2 million to the wife of former City Planning Commissioner Bartholomew Reed. The payments, disguised as fees for interior design services for a home the couple did not even own at the time, were made in the 6 weeks leading up to the controversial and highly contested rezoning of the historic Elm Street district. This was the rezoning that allowed Thorn Global to seize an entire community of small businesses, including a 50-year-old bookstore owned by a man who later died from the stress and heartbreak of losing everything he had ever built. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the horrified silence of the room. She looked directly at Marcus Thorn, her eyes locking with his. In that moment, he finally saw her. Not as a waitress, not as a journalist, but as the ghost of every life he had ever casually destroyed, returned to claim her due. "The name of the bookstore owner," she finished, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, "was William Vance. He was my father." The world did not end for Marcus Thorn with a bang, but with the deafening roar of 1,000 camera shutters. The room exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. The carefully constructed facade of his life, his empire, his legacy, did not just crack. It disintegrated into dust on live television. Reporters were on their feet, screaming questions, their voices a cacophony of accusation. City officials who had been smiling and shaking his hand minutes earlier were now scrambling for the exits, their faces masks of panic as they tried to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Thorn stood frozen at the lectern, a statue of a broken man. The arrogance was gone. The power was gone. All that remained was a hollowed-out shell. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing paths through his expensive makeup. His security team rushed the stage, trying to form a protective cordon around him, but it was useless. The real damage was done. They were not protecting him from the crowd. They were merely escorting a dead man from his own public execution. As they led him away, his eyes, wide and vacant with shock, found Elena's one last time. In them she saw not hatred, but a terrifying, complete and utter incomprehension. He still didn't understand how the world he had built so carefully could be undone by a person he had never even bothered to see. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. What was the most satisfying moment of Marcus Thorn's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments below, share your reaction with us, and tell us how that final confrontation made you feel. We want to hear from you as we witness the final chapter of this incredible story of resilience and righteous victory unfold. The battle has been won, the Titan has fallen, and now we will see what rises from the ashes of his corrupt empire, as a new era of justice dawns, led by the very woman he so foolishly underestimated. Her journey is not over. In fact, it is just beginning, and the world is about to see the true power of a brilliant mind fueled by a righteous cause and an unbreakable spirit. The months that followed were a blur of headlines and legal proceedings. Thorn Global Properties imploded in a way that was spectacular, even by the standards of corporate scandals. Federal indictments came down like a hailstorm, ensnaring not just Thorn but a dozen of his executives, and the now disgraced former planning commissioner. The company's stock was delisted, its assets frozen, and its glass towers became symbols of a fallen empire. Marcus Thorn, the untouchable Titan, was reduced to a haggard figure in a wrinkled suit, shuffling in and out of courtrooms, his face a permanent fixture on the evening news. Elena watched it all from a distance, feeling not a sense of triumph or glee, but a profound and quiet sense of closure. She did not attend the trials. She did not give interviews. Her part in the drama was over. One cool autumn afternoon, she visited the small cemetery where her father was buried. She laid a single, fresh copy of his favorite book of poetry on the grass above his headstone. "The fight is over, Dad," she whispered to the quiet air. "We won." She felt a weight she had been carrying for years finally lift from her shoulders, a sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. His memory was no longer just a source of pain, it was now a legacy of justice served. Her new life began with a phone call. It was from the CEO of Sterling & Finch, a rival development firm known for its more ethical and community-focused approach. They had watched her televised takedown of Thorne not just with awe, but with a sense of recognition. They saw in her not an activist, but a visionary. They didn't offer her a job. They offered her a mission. They were creating a new division, a department with a 9-figure budget and a mandate that was the polar opposite of everything Thorne had ever stood for. It was to be called the Division of Community Restoration and Ethical Expansion, and they wanted her to lead it. Her new office was not on the 49th floor. It was on the 10th, with large windows that didn't look down on the city as a map of assets, but looked out at it as a living, breathing community of people. The walls were not covered in modern art, but in architectural blueprints for new public parks, zoning proposals for mixed-income housing, and restoration plans for historical buildings that had been left to decay. She finally had the power, the resources, and the platform to bring her original dreams to life, to build a city that served its people, not just its powerful. Her first project was personal. She acquired the deed to the now vacant lot on Elm Street, the place where her father's bookstore and all the other small shops had once stood. She didn't build a high-rise. Instead, she poured her heart and her considerable resources into creating the William Vance Memorial Library and Community Garden, a beautiful, open-air structure of reclaimed wood and glass that housed a free public library on one side and a lush green space on the other. It became the new heart of the neighborhood, a place where children came to read stories and old friends gathered to talk, a living testament to the idea that a community's value could not be measured on a balance sheet. From her office window, Elena could sometimes see the garden, a small patch of green and life in the concrete canyons of the city. She had not brought her father back, but she had honored him in the most profound way possible. She had taken the world that broke him and had begun to remake it in the image of his kindness, proving that the quietest voices, when armed with truth and courage, could indeed be the most powerful of all. If Elena Vance's incredible journey from an underestimated waitress to a powerhouse of justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. Her story is a powerful reminder that integrity and knowledge are the true sources of power, and that courage can indeed change the world. For more unforgettable stories of justice, empowerment, and righteous revenge, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. By doing so, you help us spread these important messages and ensure that you will never miss our next story of an underdog who rises up to reclaim their dignity and reshape their world for the better. Join our community, and let's continue to celebrate the heroes who walk among us, often in the places we least expect.